Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Umut Alamdar, the head of security lab here at Hornet Security, back on the show, and we're going to be discussing the findings of our monthly threat review here that we do on a monthly basis at Hornet Security. So in this particular episode, we're going to be talking about some of our data points for the past month. We're going to talk about the continued fallout from the MOVEit file sharing breach. We're going to talk about the Microsoft's cloud breach by Storm 0558. That and lots more coming up in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got one of our regular co-hosts on today. I've got Umut Alamdar. How's it going, Umut?
Oh, I'm pretty good, Andy. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on the show. I'm glad you were able to take some time and join us today. And, people have heard me do the intro for the show every week for a while now, right? Bringing you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. And I feel like this episode focuses very much on that key point in that we're bringing knowledge and insight and, more importantly, data from the security lab and sharing it with our listeners. And today is going to be the first of, I guess what I would say, a monthly recurring episode in that we're going to do it every month. But here at Hornet Security, every month, we basically take a look at the previous 30 days worth of data for the previous month. We look and see if there's any interesting trends. We look at security statistics. And then we also take a look at what's happening in the security space. We provide some commentary, some recommendations, some expert thoughts as well. So a lot of great information in this document. And we're going to start doing this podcast episode on a monthly basis too, where we kind of cover the findings and provide some additional insights and discussion around those key points, right? So Umut, what do you think? Should we start diving into the reports for the episode here?
Sure, let's go. We have a lot of items to cover. So
there's a
this
lot.
will be exciting.
There's a lot to cover for sure. And for those of you watching, if you haven't seen this report, I'll be sure to include a link to it in the show notes. So be sure to check that out. It's got a lot of great data and information there. But we're going to start with threat categories. So here at Hornet Security, with our email filtering solution, we have a number of different categories for the different pieces of malicious email that flow through us. And what we saw for the month of July versus the previous month is that across the board, every threat category showed an increase across the board. So there were more threats, there were more advanced threats. So by and large, just across the board, there were more threats flying around out there. And Umut, you and I have talked about this a little bit. Really there is kind of that ebb and flow to threats out there, right? So what are your thoughts on this particular data point?
Exactly. So this is nothing surprising. So we have these fluctuations always from month to month. In some months, we have really sudden increases that we didn't expect at all. But the increase that we observe this month is more or less what we expect to see from a summer month to the next summer month, right? So usually we have these huge increases at the end of Q3 or at the beginning of Christmas, the holiday season, when we see more attacks related to the season.
Gotcha. So, yeah, kind of that ebb and flow, and some months are safer than others, I guess, is one way of putting it, or the other way around, depending on which way you want to look at it. So, well, when we're looking at email attacks, one thing that we always look at in our data is like, okay, we've got these email attacks happening. What are the most commonly used file types used in those attacks, typically to deliver the payload, right? And what our data showed this month is that HTML files were the top file type for the month of July. And previously, PDFs were the top file type. And I know for a fact in June, PDF was the top file type. I'd have to go back and look, but I feel like, and again, this is just a feeling, I feel like PDF was very high on the list for a while, even before that. And really the main reason that we identified for the PDF not being the number one slot is that there was a large decrease in PDF usage because QuakeBot is no longer using PDF files to deliver its malicious payload. Now, that is for now. I mean, we could see that change, but for now it seems like they've kind of gone a little bit quiet and they've changed their process for now. What do you think, Umut?
Exactly. So this is also quite normal during the summer season, during the holiday season. So some campaigns reduce in numbers, while other campaigns increase in numbers. However, when we talk about HTML files, we always think about simple file formats, but HTML files really allow the attacker to do a lot of sophisticated attacks too. For example, the most common attack probably is the attacker puts a link into the HTML file so that when the user clicks on it, a nice rendered web page is seen in the browser, and when you click on the link, you get forwarded to a phishing site. But we've also seen this some months ago. HTML files can be used to deliver encoded files. So when the user opens these attachments, the file automatically stores a JavaScript, for example, a script file or link file pointing at a web resource, so that when this file is then executed, the user downloads a malware or something like that to the client, and the client is infected. So really, this is nothing too crazy, but still, HTML files are something that will accompany us in the coming months too.
Yeah, makes sense. And, if I think back a little ways, there was a time where we commonly saw docx files and malicious Excel files very high on the list. And they're quite low these days, and that's largely attributed to Microsoft's choice to, thankfully and finally, restrict macro usage in Office documents by default now. So, but yeah, definitely HTML is the one that keeps topping the charts lately, especially now that QuakeBot has changed their operational mode, right? So, well, our next data point to kind of discuss is the most targeted industry verticals, right? So we have a, kind of a method where we are able to determine a threat index. We assign a value for a given industry vertical, right? And basically the amount of that value can tell you how much a given space is being targeted or not. And for the month of July, our top two targeted verticals were the entertainment space and the research industry. And the research industry, that one is really interesting to me. And I think it's interesting because I think about what would be the target, what would be the intended end goal targeting that specific part of the world, right? Research industries are working with intellectual property, and if I'm a threat actor, I want intellectual property that I can either ransom or sell, right? And I think that's got to be why it's very high on the list. What are your thoughts, Umut?
Exactly. So I totally agree with you. Usually when research companies are attacked, they are after your research results. And quite often also what we observe is when research companies are attacked, most likely nation state actors are behind it. And then they either do it in a very targeted fashion or in large scale campaigns. So because of that, we will also see the research industry quite often at the top of the industry email threat index, because they more or less have very critical, sensitive data that they take care of that can be of quite value for the attackers.
Right, exactly. And if I'm a threat actor, there's just so many different avenues there, right? Once I have that intellectual property, like I said, I can ransom it, I can threaten to release it to the public, which that's a style of attack that we're seeing with increasing regularity these days, double extortion, right? Like, okay, if you're not going to pay my ransom, then I'm going to leak it if you don't pay me, right? So, and then, yeah, you mentioned the nation state actor side of it. That's a whole different, very sophisticated attack vector for that space. Not to mention, and maybe this is a little bit tinfoil hat of me, in that there's always corporate espionage, like a corporate espionage angle to it too, right? So, again, that's probably not as common as the other things that we've talked about, but it's always kind of in the back of my mind when I think about industry verticals like research. So, and then the next key point, another key area that we look at on a month-to-month basis, are brand impersonation attacks. So what brands out there in the world are being impersonated the most with the hopes of tricking an end user or an email recipient to click on a malicious link? And to me, there's not really any surprises here. It's all the usual offenders. We've got DHL is like the top impersonated brand currently in our data. And anytime I see shipping, any kind of shipping company being impersonated, it makes complete sense, because I just think about my own family. Like, we've got a package that's going to be showing up on the doorstep like probably 3 out of 7 days of any given week, right? And I mean, threat actors know that, so if they just happen to drop one of these DHL impersonated phishing messages in my inbox at just the right time, there's a high chance I'm going to interact with it. And that's probably what you see over there in the EU too, right, Yumu?
Absolutely. So with DHL, we also have the special case that the customers, those who expect packages, right? So we get messages not only through email, but also at our mobile phone. So we get SMS messages and so on.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we are bombarded by messages, and the amount of messages, the number of messages basically render as less sensitive against phishing emails. And this is also something that the attackers know. So I think having DHL here at the top rank and also in the previous month is something that will also accompany us in the next months.
Yeah, it makes sense. We had Amazon saw a slight increase on the list as well, so kind of the same attack vector there, right? And I don't know, I kind of laugh when I think about it a little bit. Not the phishing side. I don't laugh at the phishing side of it. There's nothing funny about that. But I just think about like all this cool technology and these notifications that these shipping companies are pushing out to people. Like, I can track my package at a moment's notice if I want, right? But because I know as a security professional that these brands are impersonated so often, like, even the legitimate messages, I'm like, I don't really want to interact with this tool or use it, just out of fear that it's like some sort of, malicious message from a threat actor, right? So it's like, we've got this cool technology, but I'm afraid to use it because, well, what's the saying? Ignorance is bliss, right? But anyway, the other interesting item on our brand impersonation list for the month, I thought, was Netflix. So we saw an increase in Netflix brand impersonation, and I started thinking about this as I was kind of digesting the report, right? And I'm like, okay, if I'm a threat actor and I can get into Netflix, the saved payment information is going to be obfuscated. I'm not going to be able to get anything useful out of it other than maybe the last 4 digits of the card number. The only other thing I can think of there is maybe they want to use the credentials for credential stuffing attacks, or I guess maybe they want to sell the account, right, on the dark web, but I have no idea what the going rate is for a compromised Netflix account these days. What do you think, Yumu?
Yeah, it depends on the plan, right? So if you're
Yeah, that's true.
ultimate user, if you can watch series and movies in 4K, it may be both of. But yeah, my suspicion is that lots of accounts get sold in the darknet. And actually, we have seen some news in the mainstream media about this too. So compromised accounts can actually be used by the attackers too to watch some series, so some kind of sharing. And Netflix has been quite strict around it. So they are going after those who share accounts. But
That's
usually
true.
compromised accounts are sold in darknet for just the part of the sum that you would need to purchase the service legitimately.
Right. That's a good point. I hadn't considered that because I completely forgot about their crackdown on multi-account use, right? So, if I'm a threat actor and I was using a compromised account that got, cracked down on because Netflix saw it as multi-use, okay, maybe I am in the market for a new one, right? That makes sense. That makes all
Yeah,
kinds of sense.
something else that we need to keep in mind is that Netflix is not a service that we that we connect with sensitive data, right? So it's an entertainment service, and
Yeah.
because of that, most users may not have safe passwords configured for Netflix, and in the end, this helps the phishers also to get access to these accounts. Normal people are using a lot of Netflix accounts. I mean, when we need to configure a password for our banking accounts, we think about very complex passwords, but
Right.
this may not be the case for Netflix.
Password 1234.
Yeah.
Hopefully not, but I'm
Yeah.
sure it is for some
Mm.
people.
Mm.
Uh anyway, so that's kind of some of the key data points that we cover in the first half of the report. And the second half of the report, you'll see again if you follow the link in the description of the episode, we get into more of some of the current industry events. And, well, it seems like I can't get through any written piece of content or a podcast episode without mention of generative AI these days. And there's a good reason for that, right? I mean, it really is changing well, the world, frankly. I mean, it's not just any one industry, but it certainly is changing the security space. And I guess the big thing that kind of stood out to me over the last month is these new dark web specific generative AI tools, I guess is how I want to describe them. And of course, the one that comes to me off the top of my head is WormGPT. There are other variants I know, and to my understanding, and maybe you've got a little bit more to expand on with this point you moot. My understanding is that WormGPT is generally a chat GPT like application, but it doesn't have the ethical requirements or the guardrails that OpenAI has put on ChatGPT over the last 6 months, right?
Exactly. So WormGPT or also Darkbird have really
Yep.
strict no, not they don't have really strict safe checks in place compared to ChatGPT.
Right.
So what we've seen with ChatGPT initially when it was released, right? So people were creating malicious code, so malware code. They were actually creating ransomware. And I think you also did that in one podcast, right? So you
That's
demonstrated that.
actually
Yeah.
episode 1.
Mm,
Yvonne Bernard and I, we sat down and we talked all about that. So I'll link that in the show
mm,
notes as well, folks, in case you want to check that out. But I'll let you
yeah.
continue.
And by now, it's really hard to do that with ChatGPT. So there are some ways to circumvent the fail checks, and security researchers try that and report that to OpenAI so that they can work on it, right? So they have their own security program around this. But with models that don't have these safe checks in place, like WormGPT, Darkbird, and so on, threat actors can actually create now malicious code to distribute ransomware, using that in email attack campaigns and so on. So this is quite important to have that on the radar too. So ethical use of AI is becoming more or less a trend. So we see it more or less also in the mainstream media. It becomes a topic in the politics too. This will follow us also in the coming months, but there are also threat actors who try to circumvent that. So don't even think about ethical use. Have no fail checks, safe checks in place for this at all.
Yeah, I was reading an article just this morning. I don't remember what the outlet was, but basically it was an article talking about Darkbird and WormGPT, and there were some messages in some dark web forums basically talking about how the maker of those two generative AI applications already had other ones in the works, right? So we're going to see additional dark web generative AI tools in the coming days, and I think I stop and I try to think about like what's the end result of all of this, right? Well, when I look at generative AI in general, I think like, okay, there's going to be more of everything out on the web, right? More articles, more content in general, because it kind of lowers the bar, the level of effort needed to produce that, right? And that goes for threat actors as well, too, right? So it used to be some of this stuff, you had to be a threat actor that had a fairly high level of skill and knowledge to pull some of this stuff off, right? Now it's kind of it's bringing that bar down to where kind of your novice threat actor can stage some of these more complex attacks. And the one that comes to mind to me is business email compromise, because it just makes it easier, right? It used to be that, we'd be looking for poorly formatted messages or, misspelled words, or maybe they didn't get the OSINT right on the target, so something didn't communicate across properly in a convincing way. But tools like this kind of take the work out of it, right?
Absolutely. What we also have to keep in mind is that these models can also support multiple languages, right? So an
Right.
attacker that is only trained to generate these emails in English can now also suddenly send these emails out in French, in German, Spanish, and so on. So this is a really convenient tool for the attackers.
That's a good point, because I think about the one that always comes up in a lot of my conversations is Exchange Online Protection, right? That's
Mhm.
the base level of security or spam malware detection you get in M365. And if you go look at the SLAs for that service, the SLA
Mhm.
is only covered in English language. So if something gets through in a different language, it's not covered by the SLA, that's an important distinction. And to your point, malicious messages just don't come in the English language, right? So,
Mhm.
interesting world.
Yeah. What we also have to keep in mind when talking about this topic is the efficiency, the cost behind it, right? So in
Right.
the past, we saw large-scale phishing attacks that were quite simple because sophisticated attacks required more money, more time, and so on. And now with these models in place, attackers can quickly generate targeted attacks, use them also in a large scale, right? Because information about a company is openly accessible. So overall, I believe the quality of the phishing attacks will increase over time now with the use of these AI models trained on darknet data.
Definitely. And even the volume is going to get more too, because I think about it like, okay, all these generative AI models, they have an API you can tap into. Like
Yeah.
if I just generate a list of targets, say I have 100 people that I know are high up in their businesses, I want to target these people, I can feed that information into a generative AI model in an automated fashion, and like first go out, do some basic OSINT, try to figure out more on that person for me, and then using that information automatically craft a targeted email for each of those 100 people, right? And
Mhm.
an API kind of enables that level of automation, which it's gonna keep organizations like us busy, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So anyway, next on the list, that's kind of been big in the news, and I guess I'll say it's the gift that keeps on giving to the cybersecurity news cycle, and that is, of course, the MOVEit file transfer vulnerabilities. Now, of course, those vulnerabilities have been patched. That said, there was a new SQL injection vulnerability that was discovered between this month's report and last month's report that has also been patched. So I've got the information on that contained in the report. So if you want to look at those CVEs specifically, take a look at the report. But from a news perspective, there's still organizations that are getting breached by this vulnerability. Like the big ones, if I remember correctly, there was another government organization. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. Again, it's in the report. But like the Hallmark Channel, Deloitte, which is a big financial auditing firm. At this point, and I guess I kind of have to go the tough love route here. Like, if you haven't patched at this point, like, what's going on? Like, why? These have been fixed for a while. If you haven't patched, I'm not getting on you, but just please go out and put a plan together, right? So I don't know. Maybe you'll be a little bit more kind than I'm being, but
No, absolutely not. So this is a critical topic. Companies need to patch this, right? So we discussed about this yesterday, Andy. Something that also came up in the last month now is the SEC ruling that public companies actually need to announce
that's
breaches
true.
within 4 days of the breach. So
Yep.
I think the MOVEit vulnerability will accompany us into the next month too, and we will see more prominent companies, right, who are
Yep.
affected by this. Yeah.
I I think it's going to get really interesting because I I've kind of seen this trend. Again, this is a little bit of a gut feeling, but I've kind of seen this trend over the last 6-12 months where you're starting to see governments getting fed up with the number of breaches, right? So with this SEC ruling, the other one that comes to mind off the top of my head is Australia. I don't ask me what the name of the law was or the regulation, but I remember reading an article where they had come up with a new regulation for organizations that mishandled data breaches. I mean, the fines were astronomical, millions of dollars, or a percentage of the company's net revenue. Which, and if you're a large organization, you're talking maybe billions of dollars, right? So I from reading comments and notes about that particular case in the community, it seems controversial. I didn't read that far into it, but my point is, you're really starting to see governments take notice of the number of breaches. And maybe selfishly that's because there are a number of government organizations that have been breached as a result of some of the recent ones, like the MOVEit breach here, right? But yeah, I think a lot of the regulations are going to grow teeth in the coming months and years, if I had to guess. And you can put me down on that prediction, and we'll see if I'm right 12 months from now.
And the fees are nowhere near the investment that the companies would need to do to address this issue, right? So this is also something that we need to keep in mind. Yeah.
Exactly. So, well, the last item on our list to discuss is it's a doozy. It's a big one. And of course, I'm talking about the recent breach of Microsoft Cloud Services by the threat actor group dubbed Storm 0558, if I remember correctly. So my understanding of the breach, after I've been looking at a lot of the documents and announcements, is that it looked like it was Chinese nation-state threat actors that facilitated this. They were able to essentially forge Azure AD authentication tokens because they had gotten a hold of a signing key, right, that they probably shouldn't have gotten a hold of, and then pair that with a bug in the way that the authentication process was happening. They were able to... They had keys to the kingdom, basically. Well, maybe I shouldn't even say that. They made their own keys to the kingdom, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I mean, it's funny. Eric Siren and I, and maybe at the time of you watching this or listening to this episode, maybe this episode isn't out yet, but Eric Siren and I, we recorded an episode before this news broke where he made a statement along the lines of, like, from an infrastructure perspective, good luck breaching Azure AD, M365, or just Microsoft Cloud infrastructure in general. And then this news came out, right? And I think in my mind, this is like the first major breach, what I would consider to be a major breach of the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. Because, I mean, if they breached Azure AD, Microsoft said in their official statement that Exchange Online and Outlook.com were impacted for, quote, approximately 25 organizations. After they made that statement, a lot of security researchers in the industry were all of a sudden like, that's not what we're seeing. And if they breach that, then they could potentially also have breached M365 proper, SharePoint Online, Teams, OneDrive accounts. And the thing is a lot of these organizations didn't have proper logging in place because the logging needed to catch this attack was behind another licensing paywall inside of the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. So, like I said, I've spent a lot of time looking at this issue over the last couple of days, and I look at it and there's so much to unpack here, right? There's like... I don't know. Before I get into some of my other thoughts, what are your initial thoughts, Yuma? Because, like I said, there's a lot here.
Yeah, absolutely. So the security researcher community thinks this is downplayed by Microsoft, as you mentioned already. So more products may be affected. And what we have to keep in mind is that I would consider Exchange Online as a source or the entry point for lateral movement, right? So many
Yep.
things, many accounts are tied to our email accounts. And these attackers may have used the access to the email accounts to get access to other services, right? So when we request a new password from a specific platform, we receive an email. So it's always quite important that Exchange Online is the entry point to more products. And this could have been used for lateral movement. We don't know it yet because there are a lot of questions around the vulnerability, around the breaches. We haven't received much data from Microsoft yet, but
Right.
probably like the MOVEit breach, we will see more affected companies over the next few days. You mentioned already that the audit logs, the detailed audit logs, were included in the E5 plan in the M365 ecosystem. Um, this may be something that could be critical going forward. So Microsoft changed this already. So the audit logs are now also accessible for non-E5 plans.
Yep.
And nonetheless, now companies really need to invest into proper auditing, log monitoring tools also to make sure that suspicious behavior, no matter if it's tied to this breach, maybe the next breach is upcoming, maybe the company is already breached, right? So
Right.
they need to get a hold of the logs and try to identify suspicious behavior within the M365.
Right. And I there's so much wrong with the situation that it's so hard for
Mhm.
me to focus on any one specific area. So just a couple of things off the top of my head, like the log piece of it, right? What it really reminds me of is when an organization here in the States, because that's my frame of reference, being as I live here, right? When an organization here in the States has some sort of security breach, what you will commonly see from them is some sort of announcement or email, some sort of communication that says, sorry, we screwed up. Your information was captured by somebody. We'll give you a year of credit monitoring services on the house, right? And
Mhm.
right, and it it almost feels like that's the same thing in this situation. It's almost like Microsoft is like, yeah, we screwed up. We're gonna give you this cool logging feature, even though you didn't have it before. It feels like the same thing, right?
Mhm. Absolutely.
And I think two other key areas I kind of want to talk about. The first one being, I saw some chatter about this on some security communities, and that is the role of two-factor authentication in this process. I saw some people are like, well, two-factor authentication, but here's the thing. They were forging the authentication tokens, right? And my understanding of the
Mhm.
authentication process is, you know, I'm a user logging into M365. That authentication process is talking to Azure AD. Azure AD says, "Hey, you're Andy. Your password is correct. You provided me an MFA key. Here's your token, right? And now
Mhm.
that token is valid for X amount of time. And if I've forged a token, I have completely bypassed that MFA process, right? That's my understanding of it,
Yeah.
right? I think I'm on track there, right?
Absolutely correct. That's correct. And the thing that
And
makes us critical. Oh, sorry, Andy, you can
no, go
continue.
ahead, go ahead, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. What I wanted to mention is that the thing that makes it critical is the geopolitical view on this, right? So this also affected government agencies. People
Right.
already know that a Chinese nation actor group is behind this, and if we put that in context now with the geopolitical events occurring right now. So this makes it really critical. In general, it's a very critical breach because, we already mentioned, Exchange Online contains very sensitive data.
Yep.
SharePoint contains very sensitive data too. Teams contains all the sensitive conversations within the company. Maybe even customer data too, right? So some companies use it to communicate with their partners, with their customers, and so on. So it's something that will be big in the coming days, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, right? It's
Yeah.
the other key point I wanted to mention really quick before we wrap up this episode is that in my mind, this really brings that whole conversation about vendor overdependence back to the front of the conversation. And for those that don't know what vendor overdependence is, it's, if I'm a business and I invest too many services from one entity, in this case Microsoft, it may negatively impact my own business, right? So in this case, if I'm utilizing Microsoft for both a productivity platform like M365, and I'm also using some of their security services to secure that platform, it's kind of a conflict of interest there, right? Because if I'm Microsoft, and the act of me disclosing a security vulnerability could negatively impact my sales of M365, right? There's a conflict of interest there. And one of our other good friends, Paul Schnackenberg, on a previous episode, I don't remember which one, but he made the good point that when we think about public disclosure of vulnerabilities, most companies have to disclose their vulnerability and create a CVE, right? We don't get any CVEs on the internal state of any of these large cloud platforms, right? There's probably vulnerabilities that are happening in those platforms that, as a community, we have no visibility. There's no transparency there, right? So it creates this whole conversation around like, what's the ethics behind all of that, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And that's probably a whole podcast episode in and of itself, but it's definitely bringing that conversation up, and really, I think it should, right?
Absolutely. And to add to that, something that people get also to see in the monthly threat review is an expert comment from Jan. Yeah, so Jan is the team lead of our security architecture and engineering team.
Yep.
And he commented that many of these cloud applications do not provide proper ways to do auditing, right? So
Right.
Microsoft changed that recently because they were forced to do so. But more cloud applications need to follow so that the people can actually identify suspicious behavior in regards to access to their data and so on. So this will also be a critical development in the following weeks.
Definitely. It's going to be one to keep an eye on. And I get the feeling you and I are going to be talking about this again next month, on next month's episode. And I'm going to go on a limb, and I'm going to bet money that we'll mention MOVEit at least one time next month too. We'll see if I'm right. Maybe that's a fun game we can play with these monthly threat report episodes, right? So anyway, I think we're about out of time. I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and insights. As always, my friend, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for being here and sharing some time with us. If you found value in the show, be sure to subscribe to the show. Again, we are available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms, so be sure to check us out. And with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. Have a good one. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.